Hello, welcome to the daily briefing. Sorry I'm a little bit late today. Matt?
Nothing disturbing?
Oops.
No?
Nothing?
You all right?
Go for it.
Oh, well, Elise had told me that she wanted to ask the first question because she had to leave, but since she's not
Maybe
here.
she already left.
Well, I'll ask what it's not on the topic that you probably would expect, so I'll ask it for her.
Okay.
You see this report about North Korea and its nuclear weapons capability.
Which report? Sorry,
The
there's been
report that was in the Wall Street Journal
a few recently.
yesterday or the day before.
Hey, not Elise, sorry.
No, I don't know exactly what her question was, so
I
anyway,
saw the report.
do you have any concerns about this apparent idea that they might be able to double their
Well, we
their,
certainly have been and
arsenal?
remain concerned about North Korea's nuclear program. And we've been working with the five parties, as we've talked about, to pressure North Korea to return to credible and authentic denuclearization talks. We obviously don't always outline in detail our assessments of what we think the program looks like.
Okay.
What
All
else?
right, well, I want to get to this now, the news of the day. Although I realize that the State Department is kind of tangential to this whole
Yeah,
to the whole
and
thing.
I'm happy to see what questions you have and see if
Well,
there's anything I can
in
say.
particular, what I'm wondering about is the statement from Mrs. Weisenstein in which
There's Elise.
she. Oh,
Do you want
well,
your
hold
first
on.
question, Elise?
I asked the North Korea question, but I don't know if it was.
Well, I think
Done
I'll
here.
just, I'm sure whatever you asked about that would be fine, but I'm just, actually, the fact that the Chinese now are raising the alarm bells, they've been downplaying the North Korean threat for years.
I don't think I would not say that at all, actually, but go ahead.
Well, actually, I mean,
They've been a very key partner in working with the five parties. That includes China on this issue. We obviously believe China should continue to use its influence to curtail North Korea's provocative actions. That's something we've said for a long time.
Now, what about, some people are warning that this kind of raises questions in the sense that you are negotiating this nuclear deal with Iran, and the question is, would this provide some kind of diplomatic cover for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, similar to ways that the agreed framework seemed to? Because
Not at all. There's no the comparison is just they're completely different things, and I'm happy to talk through why a little bit. The comprehensive deal we are seeking to negotiate with Iran is fundamentally different than what we did in terms of our approach to North Korea. In the early 1990s, North Korea had produced weapons-grade plutonium prior to agreeing to limited IAEA inspections. After the agreed framework, they agreed to more intrusive inspections, but in 2002, when they finally broke its commitments, its violations were detected by the IAEA. We've also said very publicly that one of the reasons we have the additional protocol now, which is a key part of what we're negotiating with Iran, is in fact because of the lessons we learned from the North Korea situation. So the restrictions, inspections, and verifications measures imposed by Iran on Iran by a comprehensive plan of action will go far beyond those placed on North Korea in the 1990s and the 2000s. Any comprehensive deal with Iran would require, at a minimum, again, implementation of the additional protocol, which constitutes a much greater level of monitoring and a wider scope of access on short notice than was ever attempted in North Korea. So there's just fundamental differences when it comes to things like inspections, for example.
So just to put a finer point on it, you kind of learned your lesson, not you, because you obviously weren't here at the time, but the U.S. has learned its lessons from what went wrong with the agreed framework, and now the fact that there will be more kind of intrusive inspection.
This isn't about the U.S. I mean, the additional protocol is something the IAEA developed for use around the world, which was developed again in the 1990s with the support of the U.S., but by the IAEA to prevent states from cheating on their safeguards agreements based on lessons learned in places like Iraq and in North Korea. So that's just one piece of it, though. The North Korean nuclear program was at a different stage than Iran's is, for example. So there are just a lot of technical differences as well.
But you're saying that the kind of inspections that you're talking about now would not allow...
would go far beyond what was ever placed on North Korea. So obviously making the comparison isn't an apt one. But again, under those inspections, if we detect that they're trying to do anything, we have every option on the table then that we do now in terms of how to respond.
So you don't think that the deal you're talking about now would allow Iran to cheat the way North Korea did?
Absolutely, we don't think that. And if we were to detect cheating of any kind, we have all the options we have today. We would have then to respond.
Can I just go back to the original question?
Yes.
From Matt? Does this report
raise alarm bells in the United States? Is this about what you expected or beyond?
I'm not going to get into specifics on what we think about the size or the details of the nuclear
No, but
program.
I mean, in general, does it raise alarm? If
Well, we've had
without
alarm for
confirming-
a long time about North Korea's nuclear program, a very high level of alarm. That's why we have worked with our partners to see what we can do to get them back to the table.
And this, the report said that these figures were actually conveyed to American nuclear specialists in a closed-door meeting. Did they come back and brief you? I'm not asking you for the figures. I'm just asking you for
I'm
a
just
brief
not going to
about
get
it.
into those details.
All right, so,
Yes.
all right, so the statement from Mrs. Weinstein
Yes.
thanks the congressional delegation from Maryland, most of them, hers at least, and specific officials from the FBI for their relentless efforts to release her husband. But then it goes on to say, unfortunately, the assistance we received from other elements of the U.S. government was inconsistent and disappointing over the course of 3.5 years. She goes on to say that she hopes that this experience will finally prompt the U.S. government to take its responsibilities seriously and establish a coordinated and consistent approach to supporting hostages and their families. She is not the first relative of an American citizen who has been killed. Obviously, this is a bit unusual, the circumstance of his death, but who has been taken hostage, taken captive, and then killed. She's not the first one to complain about what apparently would be the first point of contact that she has with the federal government, which is the State Department.
It's not necessarily the State Department. I wouldn't assume that about any case.
Well,
I'm
other
just
people
saying
have-
I wouldn't assume that about
other
any
families-
case, Matt.
Other families have complained about the way that they have been treated, the information that they have received, and the effort that they have perceived that has been that this building has
Excuse me.
taken on behalf of their loved ones.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Is it not time for the State Department, specifically the administration generally, to change the approach that it has to the families of people who have been abducted and are being held hostage, particularly when they
A
face?
few points, Matt. The U.S. government is undertaking a review it involves all the relevant departments and agencies, including the Department of Defense and State, the FBI, the intelligence community. We are currently undergoing a comprehensive review of how the U.S. government addresses all of these issues related to hostage policies. Not the no concessions policy, that's not part of it, but the rest of it is. So that review has been ongoing for some time now. So we are participating in that, as are other agencies as well. And I think, none of us can imagine what these families go through, certainly. And we at the State Department provide as much assistance as we can. Senior people here at a variety of levels too, not just senior, but many people have been in touch with the family since he was taken. Several years ago. We have continued to provide assistance to them, as have other government agencies as well.
Right. But why do you think it is that the message has been so clear and consistent from the families that they're not?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think these families have gone through the worst thing they will ever have to go through, and I think you hear a lot of different statements from them. We've heard people talk about how supportive the U.S. government has been, but we know this is an incredibly challenging issue. That's why we're doing a review of how we deal with all of these issues, and I just don't want to speculate on these kinds of statements by families that are going through, as I said, the worst thing they will ever go through.
So you think that this is just, or partly just an emotional
I'm
response
not
to their
saying that.
loss?
I'm not going to guess as to why. I'm just not on a day like this,
okay,
Matt,
well,
and I
you
know
don't-
you want me to, but I'm just not going
Well, I'm
to.
not asking you, I'm not asking you to guess, but clearly there's a problem here. The families of these hostages and others, not just hostages. Well, I guess some people would consider the Americans held in Iran to be hostages, but these families don't think that the government is doing all that it could or is being as supportive to them as it should be. And there's got to be a reason for that. Something seems to be
I will
broken
say a
here
few-
because it's been
Well, I think you're
case
making
after
analytical
case
judgments
after
without
case.
maybe knowing all the facts here, but I will say first that we have been clear that the U.S. government undertakes every single opportunity we can to get Americans who are held overseas home and with their families. You saw the president authorize, multiple operations, U.S. military operations to free hostages that were being held. We raised these issues when you talked about the Iranians. We raised this with Iran. We do everything we can. Unfortunately, sometimes those things aren't seen publicly to protect security and safety of these efforts. But Secretary Kerry, on people being held hostage by certain terrorist groups, has reached out to dozens of countries asking anyone for help. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but all of us, the intelligence community, the State Department, do everything we can to bring them home.
I don't think, and they're not saying that nothing has been being done, and I don't think that people are saying that they're not appreciative of what has been done, but there seems to be a problem because in case after case after case, families have come forward and said, we don't think we were treated particularly well by the government. So there is a problem here. Whether
Well, I'm happy that you can make that assessment, Matt. But I talk to the
I'm not
people.
making the assessment.
Well,
it's statement after
I'm
statement from the
talking to the
Foleys, from the
people,
Austin
and
Tyson's
I'm not
family.
going to fight with you about this today. This really isn't the day to do this. What I'm going to say is, I talk to the people inside this building and in the U.S. government who work with these families. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do. These are difficult circumstances. Our folks are very committed here, starting with the secretary, who's had contact with many of these families, his chief of staff, and now 2 of them who've had contact with families. And this is something that's incredibly important to us here. We are doing a review. We've been very open about the review. We've reached out to all of the hostage families to get their input. We want it from them to see how we can do better because we understand they're the most important part of this. That's why their input is so vital here.
Do you have any idea how far along in this review process the government is? I mean, I
let me
think
see
it's been underway for at least more than a year.
No, it hasn't
Oh,
been
it's
underway
not.
for more than a year. No. Let me check and see if I have anything on that. I don't know. The group will come back with recommendations regarding changes in practice or policy. We've said the group will complete its work by sometime this spring. NCTC is coordinating the review process. I don't have any more details on where it is, but it hasn't been going on for a year, I
Is
don't
it
think.
something that the administration would consider making public, the review?
I'm assuming we'll talk about it when it's finished, yes. I'm happy to check with the team on this. And I would note that letters from Lisa Monaco were sent to 82 families and former hostages initially, inviting them to be part of the review process. The letters were sent to former hostages and families, individuals taken hostage dating back to 2001. So we've reached out to a number of families, really want to get their input and see how we can do things
Do
better.
you know how many of them
I don't.
decided
I
to
don't. I can check.
participate?
I
Okay,
can check.
and then
Can you explain the genesis of this review? Was it because of the preponderance of complaints from various families, or was it something that someone inside the government decided, you know what, we should be taking a look at this, there might be
Yeah.
something lacking here?
Well, it was in light of the increasing numbers of U.S. citizens being taken hostage by terrorist groups overseas and the extraordinary nature of recent hostage cases. And it was this past summer. I did have that. Sorry, Matt. This past summer, the president directed relevant departments and agencies to conduct this review. So we've talked a lot about this when it came to ISIL.
So it's almost a year. You mean summer of 2014, because we're not at summer yet.
Correct, but I think it was later in the summer. Yeah, but it hasn't been more than a year. And it was because of the increasing numbers that were being taken hostage. I mean, we talked a lot about this tragically when it came to ISIL hostages, and the nature of these cases in particular. Because of that, we thought this was an important review to undertake.
Something related to this issue. I mean, should there be some sort of a review on the use of drones? Because I mean, it seems that 128 people were killed as in pursuit of one, let's say, Taliban person. Maybe 40 people got killed. 1,000 people were killed.
Well, I think your numbers you're using are, I think, it seems like you're just making them
I
up.
can send you the numbers, but I'm saying there are real figures. In fact, today, in the fight against ISIS, I'm saying that these drone strikes invariably, result in the deaths of tens of civilians. You
Well,
agree?
a couple points. I'm not going to be able to get into specifics about this counterterrorism operation itself or what it was or what it looked like. As my colleague at the White House said, the U.S. government is conducting a thorough, independent review of the operation to more fully understand the specific factors that led to this tragedy and to determine whether any changes to our targeting processes and procedures might prevent this from happening again. I think the president has also, we've all been clear that counterterrorism operations continue to be a necessary tool to protect our nation's security. That's why he and the team has been so focused on ensuring these operations are conducted in a manner consistent with the absolute highest standards. That's why there's a review being undertaken right now.
Justification for killing Americans abroad, Marie. Would Gadan and Farouk have fallen under the scope of a justifiable killing of an American combatant overseas? And as the Attorney General put it, would they have posed an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States?
Well, I'm just
Or
not
that
going. I'm
capture
not going
was
to
not
address a hypothetical process
Okay, but
or a hypothetical legal
all right,
ruling.
let's talk non-hypothetical.
Okay.
They're dead. It was an American drone strike.
Correct.
Um,
No, it was a U.S. counterterrorism operation.
Okay, right.
Right.
So is it legally justifiable just because it was an accident? You didn't know they were there?
As I think the president has said, as Josh Earnest has now said, that these were operations taken consistent with the existing policy guidance governing operations in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. What we do is in accordance with our legal obligations. Again, there's a review being undertaken at the moment.
Right. So they thought it was an Al Qaeda compound. They believed that. They took that.
And
they
indeed,
struck,
it
and
was
and
an Al Qaeda compound.
And in fact, there were Americans inside. So, because the intent was to strike an Al Qaeda compound, and there was no knowledge that these Americans were there, therefore, the American government is not responsible in any way for their deaths.
I think the president stood on national TV today and took responsibility, Justin.
Well, but are there any consequences? In other words, for is it unlawful in any way then to kill these Americans
As I've
just
said,
as an accident?
I said what we do. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to wade into this too far, but we've said we take steps in accordance with our legal obligations and with the policy guidance. There's a review going on right now. I'm probably not going to have more for you on that.
Is the review going to address this issue of legality?
I'm not going to get into the specifics of that, of what the review will and will address.
Was Pakistan notified of this counterterrorism operation as you're describing it
I-
before it happened?
Again, I'm not going to have specifics to share for you about where this operation took place.
I-
We've said
were-
along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region.
Were there other options for trying to go after these Al Qaeda targets beyond using drones?
I think the president spoke to that today when he said, when he referenced the fact that capture was not an option. Beyond that, I don't have more for you than that.
Can I ask a question? You might be able to answer. Not Gadan, the other guy, Farouk. How is he an American citizen?
He's a dual U.S. Pakistani citizen.
And he acquired that
I
by
don't have that information.
birth, by
I don't know.
naturalization?
Sorry.
Do you know does he have family in the United
I
States?
don't know.
Do you know if there's been any undertaking to get in touch? Like when Alaki was killed, there was an undertaking by the State Department to get in touch with next of kin of those. Obviously, the hostages, or at least Mr. Weinstein's his family was in touch, but you were in touch with them, or the president was. Do you know if there was?
I believe we
other-
may be attempting to do that. Let me check on that. In the past, we have. You are right. Let me
Right.
double check.
Okay. I guess that was it.
That's just for the Gadan family. You can't say whether that's
I
the
said
case with Farouk.
I said I believe it is for both, but I need to
Okay.
get the details on that. So let me just double check on that for you. I just don't have that in front of me.
Okay, thanks.
Your colleague Josh Earnest said that the Weinstein and the Italian family would receive compensation. There's
Correct.
no way that there's going to be any compensation offered to the others.
No, there is not. Yes, so yes, when it came to the hostage families, we are currently working through the process to provide compensation. No, even though Adam Gadan and Ahmed Farouk were not specifically targeted by the United States, they were members of Al Qaeda. Anything else on this?
Which means they're enemy combatants, and even though they're American citizens, they don't qualify for any.
Correct. They do
Right,
not,
okay.
no monetary compensation. That is correct.
Can we change the subject?
We can.
Going back to the Secretary's conversation with Lavrov this morning, over the last few weeks, or certainly since we were in Munich, the US and Europe and others have said that there'd been progress made in the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. Yesterday, you put out that statement
did.
listing what Russia is doing now in eastern Ukraine. What is your assessment as to what changed? What has triggered that increase now, and these ceasefire violations?
Well, I don't know if I have sort of analysis of the Russian thinking on this and whether anything's changed. I mean, their violations of the ceasefire have been going on for some time. I think yesterday we wanted to make very clear when we have additional information to share publicly, because I know people ask a lot of details in this room, particularly about what evidence we have of Russian support. So that's why we wanted to put that out yesterday.
So how many troops do you think are in Russian troops are in? And you were very clear that these violations are that they've moved more, air defense units inside of eastern Ukraine. Can you give us more figures on how many units or troops have been moved in? Or
Yeah, it's a tough thing to obtain or verify, mainly because Russia has tactics of deliberately trying to camouflage its involvement in eastern Ukraine. It's really hard to get precise information about the Russian troop numbers specifically, but we know there's a substantial Russian presence. We've laid out, again, some of the weapons. Those are a little easier to detect, but we know there is a substantial presence there.
Today, the spokesman for the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, refuted what you said yesterday about deploying, air defense systems in eastern Ukraine and so on. So you stand by what you said yesterday.
Absolutely.
Okay, they're also accusing the United States
I think
of...
President Putin also said there were no Russians fighting in eastern Ukraine.
Well, today's
So
statement
the
was...
statements aren't always, rated true by PolitiFact.
Well, Kushenkov,
PolitiFact. Do you not know what PolitiFact is?
Yeah, but why would they be talking?
It was just
I think President Putin said there were no Russian soldiers.
right.
Russians fighting, right? Oh, Russian
Russian
soldiers,
soldiers.
right? Also not true. Go
In
ahead.
the same
Yeah.
press briefing, Kushenkov said that the Americans were actually sending advisors to eastern Ukraine, military advisors.
Well-
do you deny that, or?
I've been very clear about this, and we have said we have been transparent about our trainers. They are close to the Polish border in western Ukraine. He should familiarize
Not in
himself with eastern Ukraine.
Right.
At Ukraine's invitation, our soldiers are training Ukraine's National Guard. We've done this, I think I said, for about 20 years now, and this is really a ridiculous attempt by the Russians to shift focus away from what's actually happening in eastern Ukraine, far away from where we're actually training the Ukrainian National Guard.
So the United States does not have any military advisors in eastern Ukraine.
I have been very clear there in western Ukraine.
So I think the amount in the
Russians actually went slightly further and said it was the Americans who were, in fact, violating the terms of the Minsk Accord. What would be your reaction to that?
Well, that's just patently ridiculous. The Minsk agreements outline steps the Russians need to take, period. And they're not taking them. The Ukrainians are making progress in implementing their Minsk commitments. I don't remember that we signed up for Minsk commitments. It's the Russians who did and aren't abiding by them.
Given what's going on now, I mean, is there any attempt now to try to bring the sides together? I think there is a European-Ukraine meeting coming up later this month, but is there any further diplomatic attempts?
I haven't heard of anything specific.
You said
The Foreign Minister will be in the Arctic Council meeting.
I don't believe he will be.
you said that it's hard to tell exactly how many
Exact
were-
numbers, right.
because the Russians are so good at camouflaging,
Well,
or they're
they take
maybe they're not very good at
steps to-
camouflaging because you seem to think that you say that they're
Yes.
there. What do they? How do they camouflage the stuff? And if they are
Well, in terms of
good
their
at
actual soldiers, try to make them look like they're not official Russian soldiers. There's a variety of ways of doing that.
you mean by putting them in uniform
not in-
outside of
right.
uniform? Well, then how do you know that they are?
Right. Well, we have a variety of ways of knowing who's there and what they're doing. Matt, I'm not going to get into more details than that.
Okay, can you talk about a little bit about how it is that, other than the changing of uniforms, that
I
they're
can see.
camouflaged?
I can see if there's more details on that. What else? Anything else on Ukraine? Okay, go ahead, Pam.
Statement from the senior State Department official that speaks of the phone call between Kerry and Lavrov mentions that the secretary raised a number of points, including removing all Russian forces from eastern Ukraine.
Correct.
What was Russia's reaction to that?
I'm happy to let the Russians read out their reaction to things. I'm probably not going to characterize how they respond.
The Foreign Ministry has some response on its website, but it doesn't mention anything specific to this.
Okay, well, I'm happy for you to ask them. I'm just not going to characterize what their response
Can you
was.
characterize the tone of the conversation?
I'm probably not going to characterize more than I already did. They speak frequently. They meet frequently when they're in the same place. I'm probably just not going to characterize it further. Yes. Sure.
In the statement, they said the secretary talked with Lavrov about Syria and Yemen.
Yes, he did.
Can you give us any details on that?
I don't have much more. Our long-standing conversations with the Russians about Syria, particularly on how we can possibly get back to a diplomatic path here. So that's, in general, what we talk to the Russians about.
Regarding this issue, Deputy Blinken was scheduled to meet today, this morning, with
He
UN envoy to Syria,
He did,
de
yes.
Mistura, and Ambassador Feldman.
Yes, he did. Deputy Secretary Blinken met with the UN Special Envoy de Mistura today and with the UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs Jeff Feltman to discuss UN-led efforts towards a political resolution to the conflict in Syria. Of course, emphasized our strong support for their continued leadership and hard work on this issue.
Do you support his new initiative to invite Iran to the consultations
Well,
in Geneva?
We're having conversations with them about what that UN process might look like, but I don't have more for you than that today.
There are growing criticisms that de Mistura is essentially in over his head on trying to resolve the crisis in Syria. Does the U.S. share that criticism, or do they believe that he is up to the task?
Well, I think I just said that we have strongly support his continued leadership and his hard work on this issue. Anything else on Syria?
The proposal that he proposed some weeks back on having a number of ceasefires in place in Aleppo, there are news that say that basically this was sabotaged by Turkey, and otherwise these peace proposals, or ceasefire proposals, would have been implemented. Could you share with us anything
I think
about
the
that?
person responsible for putting ceasefires in place is Bashar al-Assad. If you want to talk about what's happening on the ground in Syria and who's preventing that from moving forward, I think you need to look squarely at the Assad regime.
News out of the mission. The UN personnel coming out of there that in fact Assad was ready, willing, and able to.
We've also seen in the
implement
past
these
him use
ceasefires.
the term ceasefire to cover for a whole range of humanitarian challenges, and he's used it in the past to cover up for many, many things. They have actually not been true ceasefires. He has let people starve and not be able to get food or medicine during these, quote, ceasefires. So I would take his commitment to ceasefires with a grain of salt.
So,
Yes.
staying on Turkey just for
Yeah.
a second, notwithstanding the fact that the administration is not ready to call what happened 100 years ago with the Armenians a genocide, you have called it, and the president has called it, a slaughter, massacre, bad terms, and also called for a full accounting of what happened
Correct.
for the historical record. Well, today, President Erdogan, speaking at this Gallipoli memorial, said that Turkey, or that Ottoman Turks, Turkey's ancestors, I think he said, never committed a genocide against the Armenians or against anybody else, and he said that the Armenian claims that they had were baseless and groundless. The administration doesn't agree that the claim, that there's no basis or ground to make the claim, does it?
Well, we've said, the president has said, other senior administration officials have said, acknowledge as historical fact that 1.5 million Armenians were massacred or marched to their deaths in the final days of the Ottoman Empire.
So
that is what we believe
Even though
about
you're not
historical
prepared to
facts.
call it a genocide, you do believe that there is basis and grounds for there to be
We have
an
said we
council
acknowledge
and
this is a
accounting.
historical fact.
So what would you say? It does not appear that President Erdogan is ready to accept any kind of an accounting, a full and fair historical reckoning. So what do you say? This is your Turkish, this is your NATO ally who
Yes.
you're not using the word genocide because you don't want to offend them. And now he says that he's not even prepared to do the minimum of what you want them to do, which is to go back and come to some kind of
Well,
conclusion.
I would go back to what we said about the Secretary's conversation with the Turkish Foreign Minister earlier this week, that the Secretary expressed U.S. support for Turkey-Armenia normalization and the importance of Turkey taking concrete steps to match its government's statements on reconciliation with Armenia. That's something that's very important to
Does
us.
this go along with that?
And we're going to keep pushing that, and I'm just not going to do any analysis on those
but
remarks.
I mean, is him calling the claims
I'm not
baseless
going to
and
do any analysis on his
groundless?
remarks.
It doesn't seem to indicate that they're willing to go for this full accounting.
I'm not going to do any analysis on his remarks, Matt. Sure.
Just coming back to Syria, does the U.S. still believe that the Iranians should not be part of these discussions?
Well, if you remember the lengthy discussions we all had about Geneva 2 before Geneva 2 happened, we eventually said they could be if they did certain things like accept the Geneva 1 communique. Now, that was then. This is obviously a different thing, and it's a UN-led process, so I don't want to preview what we might say going forward, but in the past, we have expressed openness to it.
Okay, and just can I just quickly? I see you got to go.
No, it's okay. I'm actually doing a press briefing in here for Take Your Child to Work Day after this, with a bunch of kids. So
Okay, great.
I'm sure they'll
So,
give you a few more minutes in the real press
Quickly
briefing.
on Yemen, can I just ask the Iranian ship has turned away from Yemen. Was that because of any? Was there any diplomatic discussions involved that caused that?
Ask the Iranians.
No,
why
but from the U.S. side.
I've asked the Iranians why they turned the ship around. I've said we have a variety of ways to raise concerns with the Iranians, and I'm not going to get into more details.
Has Kerry?
Can I confirm that independently? I mean, I've certainly seen the reports. I'd refer you to them for their ship movements.
So the United States doesn't know that the
Guys, I'm not going to confirm Iranian ship movements.
Well, the U.S.
We're
official
monitoring-
has confirmed
Right,
that.
you will
Right.
confirm Russian troop movements in eastern Ukraine. What is,
the
why,
reports
why?
Okay,
are that US
go ahead.
officials have confirmed that the Iranians
I have
are-
no
the
reason to
Iranians-
believe they're not true. I'm just, I have no reason to believe those reports aren't true. I've certainly seen them. We're monitoring the situation closely.
Has
Can you
Secretary
confirm
Kerry
that-
made
Guys,
any?
let's do one question at a
Yes,
time.
has Secretary Kerry made any phone calls with regard to Yemen over the last 24 hours?
Today, he talked to the Saudi foreign minister, the Saudi deputy crown prince. I'm assuming both of those, I know both of them were related to Yemen. Yesterday, he spoke, as I said, with the Saudi ambassador, the deputy UN secretary general as well.
Did they confirm to him, whether the bombing resumed?
I'm sorry?
Because there are reports that the bombing have resumed.
Well, the Saudis made clear in their statement announcing the end of Operation Decisive Storm that they would continue limited operations to counter certain ongoing aggressive actions by the Houthi. They made clear that would continue in certain cases if there was action taken by the Houthi. So it should not be surprising to you.
India?
Yes, sure.
Syria?
Sure. Let's just do guys, let's do one at a time, please. Go ahead.
Yesterday, about 20 Americans were part of a larger group evacuated from Yemen on Russian planes, and some of them
Correct.
expressed frustration that they felt abandoned by the U.S. government in their efforts to leave the country. In the past, the U.S. has said there are no plans for a U.S. government-coordinated evacuation from Yemen
Using U.S. government assets.
using U.S. government
Correct.
assets. Is the U.S. rethinking this policy, considering these expressions of frustration, or is the U.S. considering an effort to collaborate with entities that are already in the region
Well,
and
we have
involved
been
in
collaborating
evacuation?
for many, many weeks now. We've been talking to other countries, other organizations like IOM who may have ways of getting American citizens out. That's why, for example, when they're able to get on a Russian plane or a ship that goes to Djibouti, we have let Americans know that have signed up with the State Department how they can avail themselves of these opportunities. So we actually have been letting them know when there are other opportunities, talking to other countries, including the Indians and others, about how our citizens can get out. We think that's, at this point, what we're going to continue doing. We've also been warning for many, many years now that people should not travel to Yemen. So we are working with other countries, but at this point, no plans to use U.S. government assets to do so. India, sure. One more on Yemen. Go ahead.
The Saudi ambassador was quoted today as saying that his country didn't declare an official end to the airstrike campaign. All it did was just a shift
Right.
to what they call renewal.
Correct.
Was that your understanding in the beginning? Or
Yes, and I spoke
what-
about that at length yesterday. And I just, in reference to Saeed's question, said the same thing.
But your initial welcome of the first
Right, they've
on
announced
Tuesday,
they've announced the end of Operation Decisive Storm. They've said they will continue limited military operations to counter certain aggressive actions by the Houthis. Yes. Let's go to India.
Indian government has ordered that all funds coming from Ford Foundation from US to any agency or NGO in India will have to be cleared by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So what is your
I hadn't seen that. I'm happy to look into it.
okay now the media reports are also saying that Ford Foundation has been targeted because they are supporting the NGOs which are supporting the victims of 2002 riots in Gujarat. And
I'm happy to check. I'm sorry, I haven't
Modi,
seen any of these
Modi
reports.
was denied visa for those. And this comes on the heels of Greenpeace license, which you must be knowing. Greenpeace license has been suspended. They cannot accept donation from site. So do you think it's a way to silence the
I
opposition?
haven't seen the reports. I'm happy to check.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
Syria.
Mhm.
Do you have any updates on the situation around Kobane and Kobane, and also there are reports talking about that the people return to the city and they are in the dire need of humanitarian support.
I don't have any updates from the ground for you. I'm happy to check with our
Have
team.
you talked to your Turkish counterpart, especially when the foreign minister was here, about opening the border with Kobane for humanitarian
They talked
assistance?
in general about all the issues related to what's happening
But
there.
not anything about specifically about Kobane.
I didn't say that. I said they talked about all the issues. I'm not going to give you a more specific readout. Yes, go ahead. And then Abigail.
Again, about the case of the Mexican girl who was brought to the States by accident. First, have there been any conversations between the U.S. and Mexico about how this case was handled, given that it does center on a child who was apparently kidnapped and taken to Mexico several years ago?
We have had, I mean, I'm not going to be able to get into the specific cases we talked about yesterday, but it's safe to say in situations like this, we would have many conversations with the other government and speak with the Mexicans about this.
And then in the case of the mother who thought she had been reunited with her daughter, and in fact her daughter is still missing, are you able to describe what sort of assistance the U.S. government is providing to her, given that there is still a warrant out for her ex-husband for having taken their
Again,
child?
because of privacy considerations, I can't speak to that specifically.
Okay.
Thank you. Abigail? Yeah.
Given the new information that continues to be disclosed or continues to be revealed about Hillary Clinton during her tenure as Secretary of State and donations made to the Clinton Foundation, is the State Department still confident that she disclosed all of the appropriate foundations as she promised to the ethics?
As we have said many times here, that in her January 5th, 2009 letter with its attachments, attached documents to the department's senior ethics official, Secretary Clinton set forth a variety of undertakings addressing, among other things, her financial interests, the speaking, writing, and consulting of former President Clinton, and certain matters involving the Clinton Foundations and its initiatives. In several respects, her commitments went beyond the requirements of applicable laws and regulations, and I just don't have more for you than that.
Given the fact that the frequency of these stories is, it's like every day or every other day, and in the stories,
It's weird that
or
after
every 3
someone,
days,
says they're going to run for president, that press stories are written.
I
Weird
see that
phenomenon
you're
you
willing.
may have never seen
You're
before.
willing to ascribe motive to something.
not.
Finally,
Do you have a specific question?
yes. I mean, given the fact that these stories are increasingly coming out with great frequency, raising questions, but not actually alleging that there was impropriety. Does the State Department share the questions raised? Are you guys asking the same questions that these stories are raising about, not about the agreement that was entered into in 2009, but about whether they were whether those agreements were fully complied with? Or does this department believe that they were fully complied with, that these stories don't amount to, don't
I'm happy
don't
to check
change
with our
that?
experts on this.
Okay.
I just
because
haven't heard anything about, beyond
the
sort of what I
stories
just
raise
said.
a lot of questions. They don't necessarily answer the question, and I'm wondering if you guys are attempting to answer the questions to see if,
I'm
in
happy to
fact,
check.
or if you've already made up, the building has already made up its mind that there was no impropriety.
I'm happy to check.
Thank you.
Any update on President Barzani's upcoming visit to Washington?
Don't have any updates for you.
Okay, do you have any, have you got any concerns or anything from the Sunni Arabs over the President Barzani's statements that the Peshmerga will stay in the disputed area even they taken from ISIS?
I haven't heard anything related to that.
Okay. One more, sorry. On the oil export, have you had any, the Kurdish oil export increase? Do you have any update, anything
I
on that?
don't.
Okay. Do you have
Okay.
anything on Iraq?
Go give all the kids who are waiting all of your questions you didn't ask so I can answer them.